Welcome, and thank you for joining the EIM Regional Issues Forum. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that all audio connections will be muted at this time.
The operator,
should you require technical assistance, please send a text to the event producer. With that, I'll turn things over to Therese Hampton. Please go ahead.
No volume? Oh, great. That works well, Tony. Thank you. So my name's Therese Hampton. I work with Public Generating Pool, and I am the current chair of the Regional Issues Forum. Most of you, if you're online or in the room, the agenda is on the screen. And so one of the things we'll do is we'll start with some introductions and some RIF business. I'm going to turn this over to Suzanne Cooper first because when we're in a Bonneville facility, safety first.
Thank you, Therese. I'm Suzanne Cooper, and I'm with Bonneville, obviously. And so a couple things. If by chance we would need to evacuate this building, there's a stairwell near the elevators. We just go down the stairs and then out the building, cross the MAX tracks to the park that's across the way here. And of course, be very careful crossing the MAX tracks because trains run on them. And if there happens to be any kind of medical emergency, Eric Fedorovich has agreed that he will be our 911 caller. Eddie Eliza, who's in the back, will run down to security and alert them so that they're prepared. And I know where the AED is on the first floor, so I will be the AED. Hopefully none of those things will happen, but if they do, we're prepared.
Great, thank you. Okay, so on to a little bit of kind of logistics and housekeeping and then some kind of Regional Issues Forum liaison roll calling. First, for those that are in the room, if you want to know how to get on the Wi-Fi in the room, there are a couple of sheets kind of hanging, but you go to the AT&T Wi-Fi option, and the password is USDOE1, no caps, but you should be able to see that hanging in the room. Second, for those also that are here in town, there will be a reception following this meeting hosted by PGE and Pacificor at Altabira. And Avangrid, I'm sorry, and Avangrid at Altabira, which is 4 blocks down the street. There will just be a whole group of us going down, but it's a restaurant just a couple of blocks down the street. Do we have an address for Altabira?
It's in the Citizen Hotel, so if you just walk straight down this street here, Holiday, and cross over MLK, the Citizen Hotel will be on your right, and you'll have to go up to the top floor.
Terrific. Thank you. And then also the EIM governing body meeting will be held tomorrow at 9 a.m. It is not here, so that's probably the most important part for you. It is at the Marriott Courtyard in downtown Portland, so 9 a.m. Okay, a couple of things. We will do the RIF liaison kind of roll call, and over the last 3 to 4 months, we've had some transition in terms of RIF liaisons, and so we'll kind of note that. And so I'm going to kind of just announce everybody so you kind of have a sense for the different sectors and who represents for each of the sectors and have them say that they're here, if they're here. So for the participating transmission owner sector, we have Matt LaCar.
Here.
And Pam Sporborg.
Here.
For the public interest group and ratepayer sector, we have Cheryl Murray. Cheryl's often on the phone, so operator, can we check and see if Cheryl's on the phone?
If she is, she'll need to dial #2 so I can identify and unmute her line.
Okay, and Jennifer Gardner? Here. Publicly owned utility sector, Tony Braun?
Here.
And Clay MacArthur?
Here.
Neighboring Balancing Authority area is myself and Suzanne Cooper.
Here.
And then in the IPP sector, we actually have 2 new liaisons. We have Aaron Kester here, and then Cameron Yurkowski, who is not here, and many of you may have known him as a previous RIF liaison as part of the public interest group sector, but he now has a job where he is representing IPPs. Okay, the other kind of RIF business that we need to transition is what you see up here is the RIF leadership. I've been serving as chair for this year. Matt LaCar has been serving as vice chair, and Suzanne Cooper has been serving as secretary. We will transition after this meeting to a new leadership team. We'll have Pam Sporborg as chair, Jennifer Gardner as vice chair, and Aaron Kester as secretary. So we look forward to them, and you'll see them kind of in the front of the room at the next RIF meeting. Okay. That is all our introductions and RIF business, but I'm looking around in case I've forgotten anything. I did see Kristen Sheeran walk in the room, and so I'm going to invite her to the front of the room to have a seat near a microphone. I'll do a quick rundown of the agenda while Kristen is coming forward. So we will, the way we've set this up, the agenda is we'll do a bit of the early part. Go ahead and have a seat right there. Or you can go to the podium if you want to go to the podium. Your preference. We will do, we'll hear from Kristen and get an update on Oregon carbon policy, and then we will do a bit of a debrief from the June carbon workshop. We've got a document that has been posted online, which is the RIF liaison summary, and we'll go through that. And then we'll hear from Avista and Bonneville about their processes relative to the EIM. Take a break, and then in the afternoon we'll get an update on EDAM, and then we have a panel to talk about system market power. So thank you, Kristen, for joining us. We're really happy that you could be here. Kristen is the Climate and Energy Advisor to Oregon Governor Kate Brown, and some of you may know or may not know, but when we were having the June carbon workshop, they were still kind of in the midst of session in Oregon, and they were gracious enough to have Colin McConaughey come up or go down to Folsom and meet with us while there was still a lot going on in Oregon, and so we invited Kristen to share with us a little bit of the situation in Oregon, both kind of the end of session and where things might be headed. So.
There we go. Green light. That's helpful. Thank you all for having me. I'm happy to give an update about where things stand. I regretted that I wasn't able to be with all of you down in Folsom. I had really been looking forward to that meeting and that conversation. These are the kinds of conversations I love best in my role with the governor. But you know, as was mentioned, that sort of fell right in the middle of all of the activity in our legislative session. So I believe you all met on a Tuesday last time, and we had just the night before moved House Bill 2020, which is a legislative proposal to create a cap and trade program in Oregon, a comprehensive program that would have included both electricity, natural gas, industrial emissions, as well as transportation fuels, in a program that, in many ways looks similar to the California cap and trade program, but also differed in some significant ways as well. That bill had just passed the House with a supermajority, I believe, the night before, and was headed to a vote later that same week in the Senate. Needed to stay behind as per those conversations. What many in the room probably already know and are familiar with is that the bill never came up for a vote in the Oregon Senate. We have a quorum requirement in Oregon that would have meant that Republicans, we needed a certain amount of Republicans, at least 2 Republican senators, to make quorum in order to hold a vote on the bill. Republican senators decided to leave the Capitol, thus negating a vote on the bill. The bill was then pulled so that a week later, so that session, we have a constitutionally mandated deadline of June 30th for our legislative session. So it never did come for a vote in the Senate, so that leaves it as very much sort of unfinished business for the state of Oregon as we look forward. What Governor Brown has said in all of her public remarks is that she is absolutely committed to, continuing to move forward. Cap and trade is still her preferred policy vehicle for achieving the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. She is committed to, supporting the bill and helping to move it forward in our next legislative session, which begins in early 2020. But inaction is also not an option, and so in the event that we're not able to find a legislative outcome for a cap-and-trade program, we are beginning to work with our state agencies to understand, other ways to, regulate carbon emissions to achieve the state's goals. That's not our preferred approach. The governor's preferred approach, strongly preferred approach, is a legislative solution. Why? Well, because it's much less of a blunt instrument. And the cap-and-trade proposal that my colleague Colin McConaughey sort of shared some of the details as relates to the electricity sector with all of you had been one that over the course of several years had been sort of, carefully discussed and worked on by all the relevant stakeholders, by the regulated entities themselves, including, those in the power sector, by the stakeholders who are pushing for the bill in the environmental community and otherwise, by legislators and by others. And so that's why we're committed to that vehicle. We are certainly open to discussions around, certain policy details as relates to that cap-and-trade program. There were concerns raised around impacts on transportation and for transportation costs, as well as in the manufacturing sector. There were still some lingering strong concerns being raised from the business community. We're committed to looking at those. What I don't anticipate, at least at this point, is any significant changes as that policy concept sort of evolves to come back in the 2020 session. I'm not anticipating any significant changes as might impact, electricity. The way that House Bill 2020 sort of approached the electricity sector, both the power that was generated in state and the power that is imported into Oregon, we believe we had the right framework there, a framework that would be inclusive of all of the electricity and the emissions associated with that electricity in Oregon, and that could potentially link up well with other jurisdictions up and down the West Coast if those opportunities present themselves in the future, and we certainly hope that they so that's kind of where things stand, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any from the audience.
Questions from the audience?
Hi, Clay Norris, Tacoma Power. I'm curious if a voter initiative is in the works.
So as you can imagine, climate action has a lot of strong support, certainly nationally and certainly in the state of Oregon. Members of the environmental community that have really leaned in hard to try to move House Bill 2020 certainly left session feeling, disappointed, maybe to say the least. And while I think the environmental community, is supportive and looking forward to another attempt at this through our, our legislature, I wouldn't be surprised if they are looking, if there are segments of the environmental community that are looking at, the ballot process as another way to try to achieve similar type of outcomes. But to my knowledge, nothing has been filed as of yet.
I'll ask a question. I'm looking to see if there are others. In Washington, there were attempts to pursue a carbon tax that struggled, and so ultimately they transitioned to a sector-by-sector approach. I heard you say very clearly the governor prefers a legislative outcome and prefers the cap and trade. Mm-hmm. Has there been any contemplation of sector-by-sector similar to Washington?
Sure. So, I mean, I think you could define the sort of portfolio of climate and clean energy related policies and programs in Oregon, you know, to date as mostly being sort of a sector by sector approach. We have a, you know, obviously we have a renewable portfolio standard, 50% by 2040. We have a mandate regarding coal coming out of the electricity mix served to Oregon customers by 2030. We have a low carbon fuel standard. We have energy efficiency measures. We have incentives for electric vehicles, building code standards. You know, the tools that we see in a lot of the sort of, you know, regulatory and policy toolboxes around the country, Oregon has often been first or near first to the table in implementing and experimenting with those kinds of programs. And they've all been successful in their own right, moving the needle on emissions, but yet we are still falling woefully short of our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and those that scientists say are absolutely necessary to avoid the worst risks of climate change. And so, and then when we look at the area where we're making the least amount of progress right now, it's not the electricity sector, you know, where things are on a decent trajectory in terms of decarbonization, and we applaud the decarbonization goals that companies like Portland General Electric and Idaho Power have announced, and the efforts that are that those companies are taking to take a serious how they can decarbonize alongside the state's, you know, greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. But, you know, where we're not seeing a lot of progress right now, and this isn't just true of Oregon, is in the transportation sector. And so that's, you know, because the sector-by-sector strategies, you know, are not working to move the needle fast enough, and, you know, carbon pricing is an effective way to begin to move the needle in the transportation sector, as well as looking at emissions reductions in the industrial sector as well. That's why we are, the governor is supportive of this comprehensive strategy, this wide program at this point in time.
Thank you. Questions in the room? Other questions?
Yeah, Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition, noting that we supported the bill. If you could just explain that one of the difficulties for next year is the timing of our session. We have statutory limits on both a long and short session, so if you could talk about that. And I think that plays into the notion of trying to push forward a bill. I mean, and the other thing you might want to say maybe a little bit about is the process that got us here, which has been running, depending on how you count it, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So this is not a, you know, just a recent thing that showed up. There's been a lot of work to work on all pieces of this bill.
Yeah, thanks, Fred, for pointing out that process, because we're particularly proud of it, and it is one of the reasons why we're committed to moving forward with the policy, is because of the process and the tremendous amount of time and effort that's gone in on the part of many of the people that I see here in this room, as well as, you know, many others, both within the state and even in other jurisdictions where people were leaning in and really helping us try to figure this out. So, you know, carbon pricing is not a new conversation for Oregon. We were one of the founding members of the Western Climate Initiative, which came up with the policy framework for carbon pricing along the West Coast. Obviously, we weren't able to move forward then. It's never really gone away in terms of the discourse of climate policy in Oregon, but it's really over the last few years that it has been back with increased momentum and broader support, culminating in legislative proposals, you know, every year going back to, I think, 2014, 2015, real, you know, sort of baked kind of carbon pricing proposals in the legislature. We ended our 2018 legislative session, so every even year we have a very short legislative session that runs about 5 to 6 weeks. We ended the 2018 short session, unable to move a cap and trade type program forward at that point because of the shortness of the session and the importance of really making sure that everybody's views were heard and that the policy was really well designed and thought out. But we ended that session with a commitment on the part of legislative leadership, the Senate President, the Speaker of the House, and Oregon Governor Kate Brown at that point to say we're going to move this forward in 2019. This is our priority for the 2019 long legislative session. At that point, they put resources into a state carbon policy office, which I got to head up, and you met one of my colleagues last time, Colin McConaughey, who works in that office alongside me. And our goal really was to work with both legislators, the regulated community, the broader stakeholder and business community, figure out the details of what cap and trade would actually look like for Oregon, because the politics in Oregon are such that, you know, the more of the details were reflected in a legislative proposal, the more certainty folks would have and the more confidence folks would have about what the program meant for Oregon and what its potential impacts and benefits would be. And so that's what gave rise through that stakeholder process, and sometimes big tables, sometimes small tables, working with alongside folks, really being able to get into the weeds of how you design this policy, led to a legislative proposal that, you know, was north of 150 pages. I've lost count at some point, and extremely detailed. The good news about that is for policy wonks, like many folks in the room like this, you could read that through and really get a clear understanding of how this was going to work, and it left a lot, you know, fewer details for a rulemaking process, you know, to have to determine at some future date. The downside, of course, is it's a very complicated piece of legislation, and makes it hard to sort of talk about in sound bites, and also puts a lot of details sort of up in the air for conversation and discussion. Nevertheless, we do think that is the right way to move the needle in Oregon, and the legislative process is where we can mediate all of those details, urban and rural, Democrat, Republican, environmental, business, you know, whatever divide, you know, you might look at. The legislative process is the ideal place to mitigate those different viewpoints, that process going forward. But short session, to Fred's point, short session is a challenge, and that's why we're not starting over from scratch. We have a bill that passed with a supermajority in one chamber and was literally hours or a day away from a vote in the Senate, which we believe would have been an affirmative vote in the Senate had the politics sort of not shifted underneath it in those last remaining hours. And that happens, and we are acknowledging that shift in the political landscape and working with legislators to make sure any additional concerns are addressed as that policy comes forward in February.
Hi, Lisa Rennie with Tacoma Power. It sounds like you are staying the course on cap and trade. I think a few months ago we'd heard a little bit about there might be some interest in pursuing a clean energy standard similar to what Washington just passed.
Like the 100% clean bill that you just passed?
Yeah.
So, you know, there certainly are folks in the community who raise that with legislators. They've raised it with the governor's office. They'd like to see something akin to 100% clean. When I know in the conversations I've had where I've pushed on that and said, well, you know, why 100% clean? You know, don't you think that, you know, with the SB 1547, the Coal to Clean bill that Oregon passed in 2016, that we've largely gotten to the same kinds of goals, as in a firm end date for coal being served to Oregon customers and an increase in the renewable portfolio standard, which on top of our very large hydro base in Oregon, about 40% sort of, you know, together would have us with one of the cleanest grids in the country. And that's not to say that we should necessarily be, you know, that we can't go drive deeper and faster decarbonization in the electrical sector, and we want to see that happen, and that's why we like carbon pricing and cap and trade specifically as a tool for helping to incent additional decarbonization in the electricity sector. You know, I think there are some folks who like the idea of that. I know there are some folks who are supportive of some of the regulatory changes to your utility commission that were reflected in the bill up in Washington, and have raised some of those issues for us to consider here in Oregon. But I think, you know, from the perspective of the governor's office at this point in time, it's like, you know, if the only problem we had right now, the only thing standing in our way to to reaching our greenhouse gas goals was, you know, the electricity sector, we'd probably be in pretty good shape. In fact, we're having a hard time moving the needle on transportation, and we're having a hard time moving the needle in some other areas with respect to building energy efficiency, natural gas use, and we really need to be focused on those elements while continuing to incent further reductions in electricity at this point.
I would ask the operator, are there any questions on the phone for Kristen?
If you'd like to ask a question, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name, the company you represent, and your question. Again, that's #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue.
Okay.
I'm not showing any questions at this time.
Perfect. So any last questions in the room? Kristen, thank you so much. And I want to thank you again for having Colin come in the middle of session to be with us in June and for coming and giving us an update.
I had to arm wrestle him for the ticket. I wanted out of there.
Well, so that was a good setup to our next agenda item, which is we're actually seeking input. We want to have conversation in this next agenda item. If you notice, it's identified as a roundtable discussion. We're not in a roundtable, but we want to have a discussion on a draft that the liaisons put together of the June carbon workshop. And we thought it would just be, there was such really good conversation at that June workshop, we wanted to be able to capture it in some way. At the time of the June workshop, I think there was some thought that the Oregon cap and trade program might pass. I think there was a sense that there was a high probability that it would pass and that would go into place as early as January of 2021. So this issue of how to deal with multiple states having carbon policies was really kind of pressing. Seems that it may not be as pressing right now, but we really wanted to capture these issues because they will not go away, and we will probably address them in the future. So the goal with this agenda item, we have this document. We'll do kind of a review of it. We'd like to have some conversation about it today, and then we will also take written comment on it. And again, the idea is, did we capture all the big issues that people heard? And we're trying to capture them in a very objective way about, you know, what were kind of the issues that were identified and what are the issues that will need to be contemplated. So I'm going to pause for a moment. Nikki, are we able to pull this up on the screen? We weren't prepped for that. Sorry. So I'll kind of do a little bit of context for this. So the way the document is structured, it's got a purpose, which I just stated, which is really we want to document some of the major issues that we had identified during the June Carbon Workshop. The overview that's noted here is that, you know, we do recognize that GHG attribution occurs today for imports into California. But there are a lot of questions about whether that current attribution method is adequate or appropriate if you go to various states with GHG or some type of carbon policy. So we're kind of just stating at the outset the overview that the current we almost had it there for a minute. The current EIM algorithm is designed to support GHG tracking just for a single state, right, California's cap and trade program. It's not really designed, wasn't intended at the time it was designed to contemplate multiple states. And so there's just a question about what changes will be required to have multiple states with carbon policies. And there was a lot of talk during the workshop about the tension between perfect accounting for carbon and maintaining effective and efficient dispatch. And a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different states saying, you know, we've got a good thing here. Let's not lose the good thing by overcomplicating the algorithm itself. So that's really what's stated in the overview. Then we tried to go specifically into what some of the GHG attribution challenges are, and I'm going to hit the high points of them. And then we had kind of an other considerations section of just different ideas that came out through the conversation. So the first one in terms of the attribution challenges is that state carbon policies have different points of regulation. So one of the things that Kristen had mentioned was that Oregon in their cap and trade program, they were trying to have, and linked to California would have a similar point of regulation to California. But what we do know is Washington's policy has a different point of regulation. It's actually on the load or the load-serving entity itself versus in California, where it's on the importer or the generation owner itself. Other states, it's still unclear. Those that have passed 100% zero carbon, they kind of have a mix of both an RPS, which is on the load-serving entity, and then not quite sure exactly how the carbon aspect will play. So that's the first thing. You have potentially different points of regulation among the different states. The second point that I think Mark Rothleader from the ISO made very clearly with a visual that I keep referencing back to is that if you have states with different carbon policies, to the extent that they're not linked or comparable, they each create a different zone, and each zone will either maybe want a different way that carbon is measured into that zone, and they will likely have a different price. And so the more zones you have, right, the less efficient the broader trading among the market is. Go to the next page, the top of the next page. There is limited ability for a load-serving entity to signal the desired carbon content of their EIM imports. And this is important for under the Washington policy, for instance, where the load-serving entity has the responsibility to mitigate the carbon. Currently, under the current EIM, there's no ability for them to say, I'm willing to take electricity with carbon content, or I only want carbon-free electricity. The fourth issue that we've noted is it works well right now that the algorithm is tracking GHG into the state of California, where the balancing authority is essentially equivalent to the state boundaries. When we look to other balancing authorities, there are many multi-state balancing authority areas, whether they be current EIM entities or future EIM entities. We have several that are multi-state balancing authority. So it becomes complicated. The EIM works on transfers from one balancing authority area to another balancing schedule between those two. So when you're transferring from one balancing authority area to a multi-state balancing authority area, how do you determine who got the carbon content of that schedule or that transfer? And then the last point that was noted is that the current approach to GHG attribution in the EIM may not translate to the extension of the day-ahead market to EIM entities. There's still some current concerns that people have with the current accounting within the EIM, and then that method itself just may not be transferable to the EDAM. So those were the 5 major elements that we captured from the carbon workshop that were what we would call GHG challenges, attribution challenges. The other considerations, we had really interesting and robust discussion about is it double counting to retire a renewable energy certificate for RPS compliance and also sell that as carbon-free power into a carbon-regulated zone. We had a lot of different perspectives. We had a panel on that. We had a lot of really different perspectives on that, so we tried to just capture that and to highlight those questions that were asked and that would probably need to be answered going. And then there was a note about thinking of all the different ways that we do carbon accounting. We do carbon accounting for renewable portfolio standards. We do carbon accounting for carbon-specific policies. And then there's often fuel mix reporting or power content label reporting. And what I think we're seeing in some situations is that accounting is done differently for each one of those purposes. And so EIM transfers and how they're treated in each one of those situations is important. And then the last thing that we noted is that we had many state regulators there, and there were some important comments that they made that were important for them in terms of the things that they look at and they're thinking about. First, and probably most common among them, is that there really is an interest in the benefits that are afforded by the energy imbalance market, and that the expanded footprint really creates the economies of scale and creates that low cost. And the more that the algorithm is complicated by some of this accounting, we lose some of that benefit, and so there's concern about that. And then mixing the policy priorities with market participation decisions before those regulators who consider themselves economic regulators can just make decision-making challenging for them at that level. So that's a really kind of quick overview of the document itself. I think the idea here is if there was anything, if you were either at the carbon workshop and found something really interesting that you didn't hear referenced here, we would love to know that. Or if there's something that we mentioned that just doesn't quite feel consistent with the way you heard it, that's also what we would like to kind of hear and have conversation about. You guys are going to be a quiet room, aren't you? What do you guys think of having a document like this to memorialize these? Do you think this is important for us going forward? I see head nods for those of you on the phone.
Yeah, this is Fred Hewitt. I wasn't able to attend that, so it's very helpful. I mean, we can go back and review the materials, but it's good to have a capsule summary like this.
Thanks, Fred. On the phone, Nikki's reminding me, folks may have comments from the phone.
All right, yeah, we do have a caller on the phone. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please dial #2 to enter the question queue. Don't forget to state your name and your company before asking your question. Caller, your line is unmuted. Caller, check to see if your phone is muted.
Oh, hello. This is Todd Jones with Center for Resource Solutions. I just want to thank you for the carbon workshop and for preparing the summary. I agree that it is helpful. I just had a few comments based on what we heard at the workshop. First, a point of clarification. You know, the point of regulation seemed to be sort of less important based on the discussion than the type of GHG accounting. So what was called during the workshop, you know, source-based accounting of emissions versus load-based accounting of emissions delivered, and that seemed to be what determines what needs to be tracked and how, and it determines the potential interactions with neighboring policies. Second, we disagree with the statement, which is on page 2 under other considerations. It's the first open bullet starting with in California. We clarify that RECs in California contain all environmental attributes, not excluding the direct emissions, and the primary benefits of the RPS explicitly include reducing emissions of greenhouse gas emissions or greenhouse gases associated with electrical generation, complementing cap and trade. So, in fact, the REC does represent the emissions attributes for RPS across the board in the West, including for all power contracts. And finally, there was we mentioned a potential solution at the workshop that was discussed, or a piece of a solution. So we could use certificates to assign attributes to power in the EIM, which could look like all generation certificate tracking in Regis, for example, and there are examples of this in other markets as well. So that might address policy inconsistencies if states use it. It's a potential solution for carbon accounting, for energy delivery to different states. Bundling of certificates could be used to differentiate carbon-free power in the market. So, for example, bidders could say whether or not RECs are attached to the bid. We don't think this would be very different administratively from what ISO is trying to do now. It can be automated. And thank you again for the opportunity to comment and for preparing the summary.
Great. Thanks, Todd, and we appreciate your participation in the workshop. We will take written comments this document, so I think actually your suggestion that maybe the rewording of the first sub-bullet would be helpful in comments, and then your suggestion on potential solution would be helpful in written comment as well. Question on the phone.
All right, let's go to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Teresa, this is Jim Ferrara at PID. I was just going to say thank you for that write-up, and I do find it useful in response to your question.
Great. Thank you. We have it.
Rebecca Smith, Oregon Department of Energy. I'll echo everyone else in thanking you for this summary. I do have a question. You mentioned that you will be accepting comments. Is this more of an ad hoc, send them in when you've got them, or is there a deadline? And then as a follow-up question, do you have any plans to continue to discuss this subject? Thank you.
Great question. So, yes, the plan is to take comments through Friday, September 20th, so about 3.5 weeks. And the ability, I'm going to turn to Nikki and let Nikki describe how you can provide comments.
Hi, this is Nikki Mom. I'm with the California ISO. So we are going to be putting out a market notice with a link to the document and then also information about the Regional Issues Forum mailbox that you can submit the comments to. The deadlines will be on the ISO and EIM calendars, but that information will be coming out shortly and should be available through the California ISO market notice and then also on the Regional Issues Forum pages. So hopefully that helps.
And to your last question, which is, will we continue to have conversation about this? I'm gonna ask the group 2 questions. First, let's have a conversation about that in this room, right? Do you think we should continue the conversation within the Regional Issues Forum, number 1? And let's have that conversation first. I'm not going to give you the out of putting it in your written comments until we have this conversation. So, do folks have thoughts in the room about whether it makes sense to continue these conversations in the Regional Issues Forum?
This is Pam, and I'll maybe start things off. I think a lot of the feedback I heard from our meeting was that it was definitely a unique opportunity to bring a lot of different experts together that don't always have an opportunity to get together, and that forum was very helpful and beneficial to those who were able to participate in it. And so I think the question for this group, which I think is more focused on specifically the energy imbalance market, is how do we keep something like that going, and how do we continue to leverage the opportunity to bring diverse subject matter experts together around carbon or even around other topics that might lend themselves to this type of workshop setting. And I do hope that other people who are here, we have a very large room and lots of smart people in the room, and I hope we get some thoughts and comments on that.
So this is Fred once more. This is an issue I've not been real involved with the last couple of years, but keeping an eye on it. But I do go way back on this to the early days of the Western Climate Initiative. I remember Rich Cowart coming in and talking about the advantages of a load-based approach. We ended up with first jurisdictional deliverer. Some of you know that whole history, and things have only gone, in more complicated directions since then. But really necessarily so. It's really important for this, and I speak on behalf of my own organization, but my own personal involvement in the climate issue for a long time. It's really important to have environmental integrity in this, the EIM, in the Western markets, broadly speaking. It's not an easy thing to do. I think we have missed, and probably could still take another look at other options, such as, for example, doing environmental attributes and e-tags as a way to assist with some of these policy issues and accounting issues. I mean, there's ideas out there that we ought to be looking at that probably go beyond the scope of the EIM, the RIF and the governing body. But nonetheless, I think that there are some, and the other thing, just watching and reading, a fair bit of the material and looking at the presentations that the RIF has been discussing is this is not, I mean, this is an unfolding story. And of course, with the prospect, I would say, I hope when, not if, the EDAM moves forward, you know, we're going to have to tackle a whole bunch of new aspects to that, not to mention evolving state policy. So I actually think that this is a pretty high priority for the RIF going forward. It's a quote-unquote safe place to discuss this stuff and to bring both policy and technical perspectives to the table in a way I don't see really anywhere else.
Thanks, Fred.
Rebecca Smith, Oregon Department of Energy. We were involved in the 2007 EIM RIF, where I believe this topic was last discussed in this body, and we certainly still see it as a priority as well, if for no other reason than as states in the West continue to develop new renewable and carbon policies, opportunities to harmonize those policies are going to really help that push towards a Western market. We've been involved in that conversation for some time. We actually spent some time casting about trying to find an organization that might be the right one to host that discussion, and I think that the EIM Regional Issues Forum is a great candidate. In terms of your question about how to continually bring those people together to whom this makes sense, I don't have a great response for that, but I do think it's kind of one of those field of dreams things where there are enough people interested in the conversation, and I think that if we tackle it and give it space, that we'll all show up. Thank you.
Other comments on that same topic in the room? Is this, you think the Regional Issues Forum is the right place to continue this conversation? Put words to that nod. I saw a head nod. Others, I saw a couple head nods.
I guess I'll just put in a quick plug that we would appreciate, speaking on behalf of the liaisons, I think maybe I'll take that liberty. You know, if you have suggestions on format or, you know, what kinds of information would be useful for future events, I think it was a first for us and really at Teresa's instigation to have a, you know, full-length workshop on one topic as kind of a break from our usual multi-topic format, you know, this agenda today. We could do that again next year and do a dedicated day again on this topic or some other flavor. So please, in your comments, you know, give us your suggestions. We're looking for good input. Thank you.
And I think to Pam's point, it would be interesting to get your input on who do you think should be the right people in the conversation and in the room, because we have the ability then in terms of who we ask for to be panelists or moderators or things like that. It would be helpful to get that input as well. Okay, I'm going to check one more time on the phone if there are any questions or comments. And I'll ask one more time in the room.
There are no questions or comments on the phone at this time.
Thank you. Okay, so again, the comments, we will request comments by September 20th. I think as Nikki said, a market notice will go out, so you'll have that information, but you can always go to the Regional Issues Forum website, Western EIM, it's under Governance, Regional Issues Forum, that'll have this document is already posted there, so you can find the document there and then find the email there in order to give comments. Okay, let's transition now to, we wanted to hear from Avista, who has made a decision just this last spring to join the EIM, and hear from them about their process to decide.
Okay, thanks, Therese. So my name is Scott Kinney, Director of Power Supply at Avista, for those that don't know me. And Therese did ask me if I'd be willing to come and just talk briefly about our decision process, because we did take a little bit different approach from most of the other IOUs in the region. So that's why I'll talk a little about why today. So next slide. So just quickly, what we'll talk about is just give you a brief overview of who Avista is, what's our generation portfolio look like, load levels, things like that. Then we'll talk a little bit really about, about our decision process, about how we were in a monitoring mode for quite a while, And then some drivers and risks changed on us recently that made us take another detailed look at joining the market, of which we recently did or intend to join. And then a high-level look at our cost and benefit analysis that we've done, and then kind of a quick update on our current status. So feel free to ask questions as I go, or you can save them to the end, whatever. I'll do my best to try to see if there's questions out there. So just quick overview. So we are a gas and electric utility serving customers in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. As you can see, we've got almost 380,000 electric customers and just under 350,000 natural gas customers with about 1,750 employees. We do have a subsidiary, Alaska Electric Light and Power is the power company that serves Juneau, the city of Juneau in Alaska. So we purchased them about 5 years ago, so they're a subsidiary. They operate as an island up in Alaska. When you look at our generation, so our maximum capacity is just under 1,900 megawatts. And then we have quite a few more resources under long-term contracts, 550 megawatts of thermal and hydro power purchase agreements. We've got about 50 megawatts of PURPA currently. We do have 105 megawatt wind PPA and just recently brought on 20 megawatts of solar under another PPA. As far as our load goes, you can see average, we're about 1,070 average megawatts. We are a winter peaking utility, so our summer load growth is significantly larger than our winter right now. So sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, we may actually become a dual peaking utility. But we also serve a little over or right around 600 megawatts of other company load, which primarily is Bonneville customers and our balancing authority. So I thought I'd indicate that as well. So when you look at just from a percentage basis, we are about a little over 55% renewable today, most of that being hydro, but we do have a biomass plant that I just showed a picture of up north of Spokane. And then we've got the PPA for both the Palouse wind and also solar make up about 4% of our portfolio. The remainder of our portfolio are thermal facilities, either natural gas or coal. And in Washington, we do have we have RPS requirements, so currently under 9% of our load needs to be served by renewables, and that jumps up in 2020 to 15%. So what did we do for a while the Northwest Power Pool MC initiative folded and others were joining the market? We really went into a monitoring mode. And the reason for that is the risks that are the needs and risks that were driving other utilities to join. We just didn't see those same needs and risks ourselves. As I mentioned, we really had a small penetration of renewables in our BA, and with the hydro backing it, we had a lot of flexibility to follow that wind. So we didn't have a driver from that perspective. We had done some assessments around costs and benefits, and the economics at that time they weren't compelling enough for us to join. So we continued to just engage in the market development as others joined. We've been heavily involved in the public processes and meetings that have been taking place the last 4 or 5 years. And we've done a lot of outreach with the EIM entities that are currently operating in the market to learn from them as we were continuing to evaluate and make decisions about joining. We did become a CAISO scheduling coordinator. We got certified in June of 2016, so we have been participating in the CAISO market for. And then the other thing we did during this period of time is we started to look at our infrastructure from a metering and controls, telecom networks, all of those internal infrastructure needs that we may have to change or modify or upgrade if we did join. So we took that time to do those evaluations as well. So what changed? So we started to see some market liquidity concerns in the summer of 2018. We had several days and several hours in those days where it was really difficult to find a counterparty in the near term. And so that's the first time that we started to experience that. And that had a lot to do with the current EIM participants having to meet their ramping and their resource sufficiency tests. So they weren't willing to do business with those non-participants during the stress times. And so that started to show as a possible risk for us. And then also with Northwestern committing to join and then Bonneville seeking to join in the near term, that meant basically all of our neighboring utilities were going to be in the market. So this liquidity risk really started to really rise up and really become a concern for us. The other thing that we've seen a change in is with regards to renewable penetration and the potential for a significant increase in our BA of renewables integrating. I indicated there's about 1,100 megawatts in our transmission queue currently, all renewables, a mixture of wind and solar, a fair amount of that PURPA as well. So we're seeing an increase from the PURPA perspective as well. So we see that definitely that there's that risk for the additional renewables integrating in our BA, and as others have seen who are participating in the market, there's a lot of benefit from participating in the market to help balance those renewables and bring down that cost to integrate. We did recently issue a renewable RFP, not based on need, but based on our understanding of where we thought the market was at with regards to renewable pricing. So we issued an RFP last year. And then earlier this year, we signed a power purchase agreement for a wind facility, Rattlesnake Wind, that will integrate into our transmission system in central Washington, and that'll come online in 2020. Another thing for us is we did recently issue our own clean energy goals of being 100% clean by 2045 and being carbon neutral by 2027. So that's something that we're going to try to achieve. Of course, economics are a part of that. We got to maintain reliability as well, but we do have goals out there from a clean energy perspective. So that'll probably drive some additional renewable integration into our system. And then, of course, state policies. We just heard about Oregon, and we know that cap and trade's probably in the near future. And we recently, in Washington, have the passing of Senate Bill 5160, which really will drive renewable growth in our requirements to serve our loads. Then economics. We've been monitoring how the market's been operating and seeing that there's been, I think, significant more benefit achieved by participants than what was anticipated through studies. And I'll share kind of our study results as well. So we think that the benefits are started the cost-benefit ratio for us is starting to change based on just the maturity of the market. And then there's other risks too for not being a participant, from not only the liquidity, but higher dispatch costs for us if we aren't a participant, but also we are seeing that reduction in our current optimization that we do as more and more entities join the market. There's less counterparties to do business with. So that's another thing that we considered in our decision. So just quickly looking at the cost and benefit for us. So we have a range up there of 21 to 26. Our goal is the 21 million, and the 26 is contingency, because I think we all know as we do large projects, we're not very accurate necessarily all the time with all of our estimates, and there's more things that may come up. So anyway, we're driving for 21 million. That is an all-in cost. I know it's hard to compare it with other entities and what they publish with regards to what their cost estimates are, but this includes anything, meters, controls, anything associated with the EIM project. As far as what the end cost of joining the market becomes for us, that number will probably be modified as we go in and really determine what are speed-up costs, what are things we would have been doing otherwise, but for now we're capturing everything under a single business case for us. And then we're anticipating about $3.5 to $4 million in ongoing costs, and the primary drivers for that is about 12 new positions. We do have to add another operating desk in our system operations area, which is 5 new operators, so that's a large component of those ongoing costs. So I think others have experienced that as well. E3 did do a benefit study for us, and their study showed a full range of benefits of $2 to $12 million for us. We've further evaluated that assessment and broke that down a little bit to what we felt were more assumptions that more in line with how we operate, and so that range for us was about $3.5 to $9 million, with our base around $5.86 million is what we're anticipating from the market, from operating in the market. So kind of where are we at currently? So we did get approval from our officer team back in April to join, with a go-live date of April 1 of 2022. So we've given ourselves a little bit more time than others as far as to prepare and join the market. We did sign the integration agreement with the California ISO on April 25th of this year. And then shortly after that, we did hire Utilicast as our system integrator, and they started working with us in May. And where we're currently at is we're upgrading and replacing meters, generation controls, expanding our telecom networks from that side of for facility infrastructure needs. And then we're also been heavily involved and engaged in developing our RFPs for our new software applications. And we recently issued our outage management RFP, and we're working on our bid-to-bill RFP that we'll release later this fall. The other focus that we've got going right now is change management. We've heard from those that we visited. That's a big component of this project. So we've taken that advice seriously, and we're really working on training and staffing and that whole change management process. And then because we are a little ahead of the game, CAISO will file our implementation agreement with FERC probably the end of this year, Q1 of next year, to be in line with their tariff of a 24-month implementation. So we'll look for approval from FERC in April of 2020, officially be in the CAISO process. So that's, I believe, all I had. Other than those of you that have integrated already, that top is our technology roadmap and all of our integrations. So you guys are well aware of what a spaghetti diagram that is.
Questions for Scott?
Jennifer.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for the presentation. This is Jennifer Gardner with Western Resource Advocates. You mentioned it sounds like a couple of driving forces for why Avista eventually decided to join EIM. You mentioned the reduction in trading opportunities and then the increase in renewable energy penetration within your balancing authority. I'm curious if you can identify one over the other as sort of the primary driver, or were these two things sort of happening in tandem and they both became sort of equal drivers behind the decision?
Yeah, I think it's probably they were equal. Just, you know, again, the liquidity risks and concerns that we started to see last summer was that happened about the same time we saw a significant upturn in our interconnection requests and our transmission queues. So they kind of happened together. And those are, you know, a couple of the drivers we've been monitoring for the last several years with regards to the benefit. And I think since they both kind of happened together and came together, it really made that decision for us, I think, probably easier because we had several drivers.
Other questions for Scott? Can you go back to your benefits slide for a minute? I had a question there, if others don't. The full gross range is $2 million to $12 million, but the expected, and that is net of your annual costs?
Well, so the range, you know, it's based on critical items like how much transmission do you assume is available in the market, how much renewable production. And so that's when we went back and looked at, okay, what makes more sense for us with regards to those key drivers on the benefits side, and that's where we narrowed it down a little bit. Also, we tried to go back and compensate or try to figure out how much business that we're doing today kind of we would be able to take advantage of even without the market, so you can really assume it's a market benefit because we're doing some optimization today, being a scheduling coordinator in CAISO and other short-term business. So that's what we were just trying to factor in to make this really more realistic to how we operate from how the study was done.
And maybe you mentioned it and I missed it. Are you still exploring your transmission approach?
At this point, yes.
You're donating, or how is your approach to that?
We haven't determined yet.
Okay, still open.
Still to come, or more to come.
Right.
Scott, can I follow up on that transmission question, recognizing that you haven't developed your approach, but just which EIM participating balancing authorities do you interconnect to today?
Oh, good question. So we interconnect with Idaho, Pacific Core, Northwestern. Well, Bonneville's not in yet, but that's one of ours. And I guess technically with Puget at the Mid-C, if you consider that an interconnection or not. So.
Seth Nelson with Black Hills Energy. You have an estimate of 21 to 26 million of startup costs. Could you roughly break those out into buckets of what what those include?
Yeah, probably about, I would say 40% of it's probably technology. Maybe actually probably 50% of it's technology, and the other, making up the other 50% is our own internal labor plus the system integrator costs with Utilicast. And then, of course, our infrastructure costs. So our metering and controls and stuff isn't, it's probably, that cost itself is probably maybe 15 or 20% at the most of that total. So it's really the software and the labor is driving most of the cost.
I think there's a question back there. Just find a microphone, the closest microphone.
Yeah, hi, this is Alan Combs with
Hang on, you're still not on.
There you go.
There we go.
So my question is whether you'll have documents for independent generators on what the requirements are. And are those going to be like in a tariff filing or BPMs? Again, just for the metering or obligations for non-owned generation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we currently don't have any true IPPs in our BA. We're pretty unique, I think, from that perspective, other than some small gen under PURPA or anything we have long term. But we are in the process of working with those generating owners to develop some documentation and requirements around that. So we would extend that to any future IPP. And more than likely, it's going to be under a business practice, but we'll see if we need to do more.
Are there other EIM entities in the room that have IPPs within their balancing authority area that are participating? I'm just curious, that question for maybe some of the other EIM entities. Sarah, Mary, just wondering. Do you have IPPs in the PGE balancing authority area that are participating?
No. As far as I know, Pacificor is the only one, but I could have missed Hill along the road here.
You have one. Okay. And do you have it as a business practice manual? How have you captured that?
We do have a BPM associated with our balancing area, so we have tried to capture a lot of that. But since we were, sorry, I don't think this is on. Is that on? Okay. So since we were the first to join, though, I'm not sure we fully understood all of the complexities and nuances that maybe some of that might arise from that. So I think that's something that maybe we are not necessarily the best example of that potentially.
Therese, if I could follow up. I mean, all of the EIM entity tariffs that have been written to date, as far as I know, are written from the vantage point of open access to the market. So they're all sort of written with provisions in mind for participating resources. Whether or not there really is that economic opportunity inside any balancing authority really is just very much dependent on that particular, BA's topology. So it's all in there, though, at least at a high level. But Kelsey's point is well taken, which is that, the devil is really in the details when you start to work out what does it actually take to get it off the ground when you're not part of the incumbent utility that sets the entire market structure up.
Are there any questions on the phone for Scott?
No questions in the queue.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. And now we'll transition to Suzanne Cooper and get an update on Bonneville's process.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Does anyone else want to stand up just for a short stretch break? All right. So I'm going to give an update about where we're at in our EIM decision process. And many of you have, because I look around and I see a lot of familiar faces in this room of people who participating in our public process, but then I also see less familiar faces, so I think I will take a cue from Scott and give a little bit of background about Bonneville. We are a federal power marketing administration under the U.S. Department of Energy. We own and operate about 15,000 circuit miles of transmission, high voltage transmission across the Pacific Northwest. If we were to pull up one of the maps that Scott had up there that showed some of the EIM entities and where his utility is, you would see, I ask you to envision the white space in the Northwest where where the majority of Bonneville's balancing authority is, and it would cover the white space that was in that map in Oregon and Washington, some in North Idaho, some in Northwest Montana, Northeast California, and Northwest Nevada. So our balancing authority is across multiple states, and Scott mentioned we have loads in other folks' balancing authorities. Some of our public power preference load is in those balancing authorities. We market the output of 31 dams on the Columbia and Snake Rivers, and as well as one nuclear plant that is in Richland, Washington. So that is about 20 to 22,000. I'm looking at Steve. I get loose with the facts sometimes, so some people fact check me. Nameplate, 20 to 22,000 or so nameplate capacity for our generation fleet that is actually owned and operated by the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation. We have, similar to Avista, been involved, and many of you in the room have been involved in looking at organized market formulation across the West since forever. We just had our 82nd birthday celebration last year as an entity, so whenever it started, I'm sure we were involved. And our primary customers on the power side are public utilities by statute. They have preference to the power that is generated off the federal hydro system. We have a lot of customers on the transmission side as well who use point-to-point and network transmission off of our system to meet their loads. In July of 2018, we kicked off a formal public process to explore if and under what conditions BPA could join the energy imbalance market. Through that process, we held monthly meetings right here in this room. That's why there's so many familiar faces, folks who've participated in our process. And with the goal of really exploring, in particular, about 8 foundational issues that were important to whether we could join the market. How would the federal dams participate in the market? How would our transmission system, what transmission usage model would we use? Governance of the market power issues, carbon obligation in the EIM, resource efficiency for the balancing authority, settlements, EIM settlements, and our cost and benefit analysis. So those were the 8 prime issues that we identified, and throughout about a year's worth of monthly meetings, we held discussions with our customers and stakeholders, got feedback from them, ideas from them. It was a pretty involved and engaged conversation. Also, one of the things we did was we identified 4 principles for EIM participation that would drive our decision-making around how we would potentially participate in the market. And those principles were that we needed any participation to be consistent with our statutory, regulatory, and contractual obligations. We needed to maintain reliability of both the of power and transmission to our customers. Participation by resources needed to be voluntary, just like it is currently in the EIM, and it needed to remain so. And the 4th principle was that our decision to join or not would be based on a sound business rationale. Now, as we were having these monthly meetings and discussions, we were on a parallel track having conversations and meeting with CAISO staff. And in meeting with CAISO staff, those discussions really focused on some of the more technical aspects of EIM operations and requirements, and also discussing and negotiating aspects of an implementation agreement. So in June, on the 20th of June, both of these processes kind of culminated in the release of what we call our letter to the region, which I forgot to bring my prop up here. So the letter to the region is what we aptly refer to this document. It is a 3-page letter from our administrator and about 120 pages worth of attachments. It's actually a pretty good read. I know many of you have read it. And what this letter to the region is it is our proposal to sign an implementation agreement with the California ISO. It includes our business case for doing so, which is based on both cost-benefit analysis results as well as a link to our agency strategy that we released in 2018. One of the goals of our strategic plan is to modernize ourselves, modernize our assets. Grid modernization is our shorthand for it, but basically bring our commercial and operational systems well into the 21st century, which I think most utilities have either done work or need to do work in that regard, and we're not immune to that. It also articulates our view of our legal authority to join the market, which is very important because, of course, one of our principles is that EIM participation for Bonneville needs to be consistent with our statutory obligations and requirements. It talks about how we propose to approach or address each of the 8 policy issues that I kind of rattled off before, and we asked for public comment on this document and all of the kind of ideas and proposals that are within it, and that closed on the 22nd of July. We got quite a few comments, I think about 30-ish, fact check, about, and are in the process of going through those comments and determining how to respond to those comments. And ultimately what that will result in is the release of a record of decision from our administrator with regard to whether or not to sign the implementation agreement. And we're schedule-wise, we anticipate releasing that record of decision in the latter part of September, so about 3 weeks or so from now. So you might think that's the end of our process, but it's not. I shouldn't have gone to that. I shouldn't have gone to the slide just yet, but okay. It's up now. So also in the letter to the region, we outlined a 5-phase framework for decision-making. We've had the exploratory phase. That was the month or year of public process and meeting discussions. We're in phase 2, the decision around signing the implementation agreement. So you might ask, why do you need phases 3, 4, and 5? Well, we need these additional phases because there are a number of remaining policy issues to address. And the signing of the implementation agreement in and of itself, it definitely would signal a very strong intent for the agency to join the market. We'll be committing resources to implementation, to specific systems and processes to be able to participate in the market. So it's a very strong signal, but because there are a number of policy issues that are still 8, we need to do some more work. So we've identified timeline-wise here and phase-wise what those processes are. The first one is what we call the post-ROD policy discussions. Or post-ROD policy decisions. So there were a number of issues that we need to work through outside probably of our rate case setting and our tariff and conditions processes, which are phase 4. So we're going to, if we sign the implementation agreement, we'll start shortly thereafter an additional conversation with our stakeholders on a number of issues, and actually those issues are listed in the letter to the region, but I'll give you a flavor of them. Network transmission usage. So the utilization discussions that we had earlier were maybe focused a little more on interchange transmission, allocation of EIM charge codes, resource efficiency at the sub-BA level, et cetera. So I'm not going to tick through the remaining 5 or 6 of them, but I think you kind of get the gist that there's still a bunch of work to do. And some of those issues, like take, for example, how we would allocate EIM charge codes. If we make a decision in phase 3 about that, that's something that would roll into say, like potentially an initial proposal for our rate case for 2022. So there's a lot of interplay there and a little bit of overlap, but Russ is on point to try to keep policies as discreetly defined as possible. I get the hand on the fact check on that one. And then phase 5. October through December, after we've set our rates, made adjustments to our tariff that would be necessary for EIM. And those are, I just want to step back for a second. Our rate case process is what we refer to as the 7I process. So it is outlined in the Northwest Power Act, Section 7I. So it's kind of I think of it as a quasi-judicial type process. Agree with me on that, but that's how I think of it. And we set our rates every 2 years. The terms and conditions case, or TC, is what we refer to those as, TC 22. That is where it's similar to a 7I process where all customers and stakeholders can engage on issues around our tariff. So once those processes are completed and final decisions are made, we will take a step back and look at in phase 5 what we refer to as the closeout letter phase, final decision on whether to join the energy imbalance market. If it's a yes, as we do that contemplation, then we will release a letter similar to the letter to the region, where we will propose to join and the rationale for doing so, as well as take those 4 principles that I know and explain why we think joining is consistent with those principles. We'll take public comment and then similar to the current phase that we're in, issue a record of decision. And our go-live target, if we do indeed join, is March of 2022. We specifically identified a month here of March because for the hydro system, it has multiple purposes, one of which is to enhance fish and wildlife and allow for fish passage past the dams. And in early April, that's when we start fish operations on the system. So we thought we should back up any go-live to that. So that is all that I have. I'm open to questions, of course. Tony.
Hi, Suzanne. Tony Braun. And maybe this is for others in the room as well. So you talked about grid modernization. How many of these things will run in parallel with your already internal efforts to move in that direction?
Many of them. So we identified for grid modernization in total, so we went through a process in 2018 to identify, actually 2017, I suppose, a whole host of improvements to our commercial and operational systems and some of our back office systems as part of our grid modernization effort. And I want to say there's roughly 30 projects, and we've started on those projects and completed a couple. Some of them are less critical to effective EIM implementation or participation. 6 of them are very specific to EIM. So we would, if we decide to sign the implementation agreement, we'll be focusing on those 6 projects as well as any critical elements of other projects that we've already started.
Hi, Susan. Ramon Mitchell here from Pacific Corp. Quick question. You mentioned that go live of March 2022 that you would desire, and I'm curious if, I know the CAISO likes to schedule everyone at the same time. April the 1st, Tucson, Avista, and Tacoma Power are currently, I'm assuming, slotted for that same time frame, April 2022. Have you worked out with the CAISO like a unique go live so that it's staggered that way?
Yes, they're aware of the importance of being able to hit our fish operations and not fail on those at all. So I think they're flexible. We've had the discussion. I'm looking at Steve, who probably personally had that discussion with them. So thanks. And then Clay, you had a question?
My question was related. Go ahead. Well, my question is, Clay Norris at Tacoma Power. We're one of those intending to go live in April, and I'm thinking about and wondering if you've thought about the market confusion of having go live dates a month apart, and whether that means our deadline just got shortened by a month.
I think I don't know that we've given much thought to that, the market confusion. So 30 days delta, how problematic that could be. I mean, on the one hand, it might be good for Bonneville, given how interconnected we are to all the other balancing authorities, many of which are already in the market, to go first and sort of get some of our bugs worked out before. Of course, we'd be doing some parallel operations around the same time as well, so I could see it not being such a big problem. Oh, good.
This is Dawn Fuller. I thought I'd just comment, you know, we are still waiting for BPA to make the commitment and sign. They have made this request for an earlier implementation. And Clay, to your question, and one or two others here that are looking at 2022, we're still evaluating how to handle it. We have been on a flight path so far to keep the same date for everybody because of really the mutual benefit of running the market simulation and parallel operations at the same time. Everybody tends to benefit from that. So no decision specifically yet on how to handle that, but we'll be looking at that as soon as BPA commits.
That sounds like a much better answer.
Suzanne, this is Pam, and I'm going to ask you the inverse of the question I asked Scott and say, which EIM entities do you not interconnect to?
Where is the map?
I think APS and SRP might be the only two.
Probably.
Maybe PNM. Okay.
Tucson, PNM. Okay, well.
Do you interconnect to LA?
We do not connect directly. We can get you energy, though. We do not connect directly with SRP, APS, Tucson, PNM.
What's that? Or LA. The balancing authority is not, or butted up against LA.
Oh, LA. Well, the DC, yeah.
But the.
Yeah, it's a little awkward, but yeah.
Okay. Good question. Your mic's not on.
Oh,
I can
keep doing that. Therese Hampton, I'm going to actually invite some of the Bonneville customers that have been involved in the process over the last year to maybe offer some of their thoughts and comments. But I want to say to start, PGP has been active in that process. It really was an exceptional public process for something that is this complex and with the diverse stakeholder mix to work through, very thoughtful and deliberate and really work through all of the issues that customers identified. So it was a really good process and very helpful. And I want to invite the other customers to talk about, you know, kind of what it was like to engage in that process and any thoughts you might have about where Bonneville is at in their process.
So this is Lauren Tenney-Dennison from Public Power Council. I agree and would like to second everything that Therese said. I think that the process is very helpful. Appreciate the way that BPA walked through, you know, different scenarios and did a lot of education bringing us along. You mentioned, Suzanne, the letter and all of the documentation. I think the way that you covered the documentation, there was a lot of really helpful overview included of a lot of the discussion in the stakeholder process. So have appreciated the engagement so far and also the way that BPA has charted out the next steps as we move forward to continuing our engagement in that.
I'll offer some commentary as well. This is Megan Stratman with Northwest Requirements Utilities. For those who don't know, we represent 53 load following and NT customers of Bonneville, and about 2/3 of them are located in BAs that are not Bonneville. So a lot of our members are already in EIM entities. And so Bonneville Power Services is dealing with that on their behalf. And so we're interested both from the perspective of what's already happening and then, of course, if Bonneville were to join. And to echo what has already been said, the process was very thorough. Bonneville was very effective in listening to our questions and trying to answer them. And as we noted in our letter, in response to the letter, we supported Bonneville signing the implementation agreement, listed out some issues that we're really interested on focusing on the next couple of phases here. So we see the hill just starting to climb a little bit more as we really dive into how Bonneville is going to interact with this. But I think the public process has been really fantastic, so we appreciate that.
I will share that with the team. 3 of the members are right here who did a bunch of the heavy lifting. So.
And just a reminder to those on the phone, please press #2 if you want to leave a comment.
Okay, it looks like there are no other questions in the room. Any questions on the phone? Thank you, Suzanne. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do two good things. Many of you have said every time we come to a Regional Issues Forum meeting, you want a longer break than we allow. So we're going to take a longer break. We're going to take a break from now till 3 o'clock. So we'll come back at 3 o'clock, which is earlier than what the agenda says. So we'll come back at 3 o'clock, and then depending on how the afternoon goes, if we get to the reception a little early, I don't think anybody would mind. So we'll take a break. We'll be back at 3 o'clock.